So moving on to our next minor landscape profile, we have the high island. And high islands would be places like Hawaii, Polynesia, New Zealand. And the interesting phenomenon that happens when you're on a high island is that half of the island will always be arid and half of it will always be humid. And so the wind side will typically be humid and the leeward side will typically be arid. So it's almost like you have the tropics on one side and a desert on the other. So there will actually be a distinct line where it changes. It's usually no more than about 1 kilometer wide where it makes that transition. And that's because the rain drops out on the front end. This can easily be seen when we look at a satellite image of Hawaii. And if you bring the wrong elements into a high island situation, for example, if you bring goats into a fiery, dry landscape, then you have the potential to graze it out and burn it out and do a lot of damage to that landscape. So Aruba is an example of a high island that permaculture is helping to heal right now. Venezuela is another one. They're very arid and there's been a lot of damage, but they can be recovered. So permaculture is being implemented in the political policy of these places because there aren't a lot of resources left in these areas. They're really, really dependent on outside resources. So on high islands, the only thing that you need to keep in mind when you're trying to design is that you'll be using the two techniques of a humid landscape and an arid landscape, depending on which side of the island you're on. So moving on to the low islands, they're pretty easy to design because you don't have a lot of choices. So all low islands have a freshwater lens inside the island, and it comes up near the surface. And so when you're looking at a low island, swales don't work and dams and ponds don't work. Everything just soaks in. Toilets don't work unless they're dry composting toilets because, of course, you do not want to run the risk of contaminating that freshwater lens. There's no choice. It's very, very easy to accidentally pollute that lens that's in the island. And if you pollute it, then you kill the island itself. If you overpump it, then what happens is the pressure of that water storage goes down, and then the salt water comes rushing into the lens as well, which of course is not going to help you out, and then you kill the island. So there's a lot of things that you can do that destroy that freshwater lens within a low island, and we have to be very, very careful of that. So the high tide typically holds the fresh water back into the island, and in low tide, some of the fresh water leaks out, but the rain will always replenish it. You can have some pretty severe droughts on a lot of these low islands, though. They don't catch a lot of rain when it does rain, so they just have to be very, very water conscientious and make sure that you're not using any more than you have to. The low islands also typically have a lot of wind, so you definitely need some wind breaks on those islands. You typically need a lot of vegetation near the shores, and you'll need a lot of water tanks because you do have dry periods. So when we're looking at the low island, it has the freshwater lens inside of it. And for a windbreak, you would typically have it at the outer edges of the island so that it would be nice and sheltered on the interior. So the water tanks could be catching water off of a roof surface or something along those lines. So the only thing that works really well on a low island as far as growing and production goes is pit gardens. So to make a pit garden, you essentially just dig down really low, right to the surface of the lens, or potentially even into the lens slightly, and you add a ton of organic matter into this pit and into the soil to counteract the alkalinity of the soil. So you break down the alkalinity with the breakdown of the material, which produces humic acid, which counteracts the calcium of the coral to make the soil more acidic. And when you're on a low island, you can't burn your organic material because you need to return all of your organic matter back to the surface as mulch as much as you possibly can. The pits that you dig, though, don't need to be really, really simplistic. If you were to dig a pit down to the lens and then fill that with a bunch of organic material and then grow things out of it, this pit doesn't just have to have rounded edges to it. You can actually go ahead and put some ledges into the edges as well. And when you put some ledges into the edges, then you have some drier spots and some sunnier spots and some shadier spots. And this really helps to give you some variation in the ways that you can plant. You can also build the soil in these pits. So plants that like drier conditions can be grown up the sides, plants that like wetter conditions can be at the bottom. And this, if you are unable to do the pit gardens, because maybe there's salt water coming into the area where you're planting, maybe it's not just the fresh water, then you may need to build some raised beds. And because you have dry composting toilets in a lot of these situations, the compost from these toilets can also help to fertilize the trees that are on the island. So there's different kinds of water sources as well, because there would be lots of condensation occurring in these types of landscapes. It's a bit of a moderated temperature because you're near the ocean, and you really need to be able to recycle everything. A lot of problems that these islands face is that they import almost everything that they use, and there's no place to put the garbage on an island like this because it's so easy to accidentally pollute that lens in the island. So they have to really start looking at producing a lot of their own food and building materials and things like that, and recycling a lot of that material as best they can. And so sand and coral islands are both very similar in how they function. As long as it's a low island, it functions the same way. They both have the freshwater lens, and they both really need to be conscious of how much fresh water they're using and not polluting that water.